Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe.
Science. This is court day 2 of the criminal trial of Patrick Frazee. The day was incredible in terms of the speed at which a whole host of prosecution witnesses took the stand. They included Police Sergeant Andrew Leibrand. He's basically the equivalent of Officer Coonrod. He was the first officer on the scene. Unlike Officer Coonrod, he sort of came and went. He didn't really notice anything was amiss and didn't think too much of the situation. Unlike the Chris Watts case, they actually believed for a while, for a good more than 1 week, more than 10 days, they believed that Kelsey was missing. That she was, well, not missing, that she was just somewhere else. She hadn't come to any harm. She was simply not home. There are some good reasons for that. We won't go into that right now, but just to go through a couple of the other names, there was also brief testimony from Woodland Park Detective Michael McDaniel. He's basically the equivalent of Bomhover in the Watts case. There were also 2 neighbors, Angie Gerber, a 71-year-old that shared a soundproof wall with Kelsey Berreth, and Leslie Jackson, a neighbor with quite a sophisticated set of surveillance cameras. Leslie Jackson is basically the equivalent of Nathaniel Trinastich, and we're going to focus this analysis of court day 2, trial day 2, on Leslie Jackson. We're going to basically deal with Jackson's testimony more than anyone else's. There were also sort of 2 inquiries that Patrick Frazee made, and by the way, it's not natural for me to say it that way. I would be more inclined to say Frazee, but I've been told by a journalist, I think with the Gazette, that his name is pronounced Frazee, and other people have said the same. I did a poll on True Crime Rocket Science on Facebook. If you want to join the debates there, please do. But it's sort of unanimous that his name is pronounced Frazee. Personally, I don't think that's correct. Just because there are certain conventions in English where certain words are pronounced a certain way. I mean, you don't say Amazon, right? And you don't say, if you take a similar word in the English language that has the letters F-R-A, right? A good example is fracas, or F-R-A-C-C-U-S. That's how it seems to be spelled from the way you say it, but in fact it's F-R-A-C-A-S. Now the way I would say it is fracas. I don't know whether other people would pronounce it fracas. Is it dynasty? In any event, since the convention does seem to be everyone is pronouncing it Frazee, I'll be doing the same. Again, if I mispronounce it, it's just because it would be natural for me to not pronounce it Frazee. It's quite a long way of pronouncing it, and it's again just based on my I guess it's the more British interpretation of the language. Frazee just seems a bit pretentious. Seems quite a long way of saying his name. But be that as it may, I'm gonna stick to the convention. There was a similar difficulty with some people pronouncing Shanann's name. Of course, SHAN apostrophe does imply that there's a pause. But then there were some people who didn't know how to pronounce that. Some said it was Shan-An, and others Shannon. And anyway, some people just couldn't pronounce it. So it's interesting that there is a little bit of that in this case. I guess it's more on my side than I think for the average American. But please forgive me if I do mispronounce, if it sounds like I'm mispronouncing certain things. It's just coming from a different background. So then there was David Fellis. I don't know if it's Felis, but it's I would pronounce it Fellis. He's an employee of a Verizon store. As far as I can ascertain, the testimony was sort of out of chronological order, unless it was the reporting. But the testimony of Fellis came first, and he spoke of Patrick Frazee visiting him at the Verizon store on December 11th and being very worried about his call records and whether it was possible to extract information from a destroyed phone. And he sort of spoke of the nervousness and paranoia of Patrick Frazee. Now, bear in mind that he kind of started off showing no concern and just like a lack of concern, right? So there's a mismatch there between how he responded to his fiance's disappearance, talking about about what was going on as a bump in the road at one point, and then he's suddenly very paranoid and nervous, but more about himself. He's not nervous about her. If we go to December 5th, but basically a week earlier, Patricia Key, a bank ATM employee, was approached by Frazee, who said, he'd like to look at the ATM CCTV footage for particular reasons. We're not going to go into that too much here, but what we're going to focus on is, as I said, the testimony of Leslie Jackson. We'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then also the digital expert who sort of analyzed the Celebrite data, which also has a sort of parallel in the Watts case. His name was Chad Minninger. We're going to deal with how he interpreted the CCTV alerts that Leslie Jackson got. And then briefly we're going to touch on the intertextualities between, very interestingly, the dates of when Frazee approached these individuals, Key and Fellis, on the 5th and the 11th, and what was going on in the media narrative in the Chris Watts case on those particular dates. I think a lot of people are going to be not surprised but actually shocked. You should feel the hairs on the back of your neck rise when I actually cover that aspect. In the meantime, before we get to that, please subscribe to this channel. Thank you for your commentary. Thanks for your support. I was quite pleased to see that, often when you start something new, that the traction is quite slow, and I was quite impressed by how many people watched this first video. So thank you for that. If you're enjoying the coverage, please share amongst your networks, and feel free to discuss things that you found interesting. And don't forget to visit the blog where I've sort of collected some of the best tweets and the best news stories, and also the best news coverage on YouTube of other news agencies. If you want a really good analysis of the sort of the whole court day, it's sort of not going into a lot of detail, but a little bit of analysis. Check out the recap of day 2, posted by 9 News. It has a reporter that's on site, Jennifer Meckel. She gives quite a good summary of the day's events. It's only about 10-11 minutes long. Check that out. She was asked during the interview to speculate on the motive. She wasn't really able to do that. I will touch on that very briefly right at the end of this episode. So yeah, please subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, just to clarify, when we mention Leslie Jackson, she's the next door neighbor. She shouldn't be confused with Labria Jackson, who was someone whose remains were found on Tuesday, January the 8th. At the time, people weren't very sure, sort of what was going on. There was a news story saying that human remains had been found at a truck stop off Interstate 25 by residents in Aguilar in Colorado, and then this sparked rumors that Kelsey's remains had been found, but that wasn't the case. So that's a different person. It's the neighbor, Leslie Jackson. It's a totally different scenario. Now, what's really sort of interesting and frustrating at the same time with the neighbor is there was quite a sophisticated camera setup which literally caught images of the Kelsey Berreth residence from many different angles. There were 3 cameras in total, which is a lot, trained in various directions. One of them caught Frazee coming and going out of Kelsey's condo. Sometimes her residence is called a townhome, but let's try and stick to the word condo. Now, Jackson had lived in her home since July the 30th, 2018. So a little under 4 months before this whole situation happened, but long enough for her to get a basic sense of Kelsey's coming and going. It was short enough for her to get to know her neighbor a little bit, but not long enough for her to meet Frazee. She did know who he was, and she thought she saw someone of his stature, to use her word, at his house occasionally. So she may have thought he looked familiar, but she didn't really notice him. So if we compare the camera setup of Jackson to Trinastich, the difference is there's a 3 camera setup with Jackson. One camera is directed to Jackson's driveway. Another looks at her front door. According to this article, I'm not quite sure whether this is referring to her own front door or Kelsey's, but I presume it's referring to Kelsey's front door, and then a third one looking at Kelsey's bedroom window. So, just the way that this is written, remember, we're not getting any direct tweeting, we're not getting any direct verbatim coverage of the trial, so some of it is very third-hand, second-hand. So this can be interpreted in a number of ways, but it does seem as though it's referring to, it's looking onto the driveway of Kelsey's driveway. It's probably a similar situation to Trinastich, where you basically see his driveway in front, but then it sort of looks over somebody else's driveway, and actually in that case it looks over 3 driveways in total. His the Watts driveway through that fragment of foliage, and then even further in the background, in a very small little fragment, is Betty Marcoux. Her name is spelt B-E-T-T-E. I would be inclined to say Bet. I don't know if that is probably wrong, but again, it's one of those things. Do you say Bette Midler or Betty Midler? I've known her as Bette Midler, but then the Betty Marcoux seems to be Betty. So, so the other, just to get back to Jackson, the 3 camera setup isn't sort of incidental. It's not that she simply just put up 3 cameras and it was no big deal. According to her, she had caught someone stalking her in the past. So it seems like there was some justification in having a sort of extra layer of security. And what's interesting is apparently all 3 of these cameras are sound and motion activated, and unlike and I'm making an assumption here, I think unlike Trisnastich's setup, her setup was geared to sort of notify her with screen grabs of particular alerts. It's unclear whether Trinastich's did the same thing, but something tells me that that's not the case, or we would have seen that. So according to Jackson, she testified in court that the cameras are connected to an app that allows her to see all 3 cameras live, and she could choose the view of what the cameras recorded on any single day. Now, that's not particularly special to her situation. Chris Watts seemed to be using a similar app with Vivint, but there was an aspect that seems quite unique in terms of this, and what that was is on the one hand, and this is the frustrating aspect, because of the length of time, after about a week past the footage that the camera system had archived and accumulated was written over. So just to be clear, the video footage that Jackson's camera setup had recorded is gone. There's no artifacts of that, so that's not available. And this shows again the value of Trinastich in reviewing his footage as soon as he did and making it available before it was written over, before it was lost. And one wonders if that had been the case, whether Watts could have gotten away with his crime, simply because would there have been any proof of how Shanann left the house without that camera footage? In the Kelsey Berreth case, the camera footage also provides that sort of scenario where one can say, well, did anyone actually see her leaving? And this camera setup also aggravates that kind of accusation. What was really amazing was that what the cameras did was they would take sort of photographs every time Kelsey left her home. And so there was a kind of a precedent, a sort of an archive of, whenever there was a movement of Kelsey coming and going, you would then see a photo automatically taken, a photo, not video. So obviously there was video being recorded constantly, but as part of the function of the app, it would sort of in real time alert Jackson to what was sort of going on around her home. And one of the things going on was Kelsey coming and going, and each time she did, she would get a notification, a little video screen grab, a photo. So you can imagine if this was happening on a daily basis, Jackson was sort of probably tuning a lot of it out. She would just sort of, this is just sort of the average day by day noise that she would then filter out and not really pay attention to. One aspect that is a little bit sticky is the fact that although this sensor did pick up movement, there were occasions where an investigator from the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office, not sure if it was a defense person or someone from the prosecutor, but he went to the home. He wasn't always picked up by cameras as he walked by Kelsey's door. So after Jackson's testimony, Adam Steigerwald's cross-examined this particular witness. He is Frazee's primary attorney, and Steigerwald sort of emphasized the fact that Jackson wasn't home for most of December 22nd. In other words, basically just saying, you didn't really verify anything directly. And Jackson sort of countered by saying that she did check the cameras often on that day because of her awareness of the case. I'm not sure if that really holds water, because she would have only become aware of it many days later. In any event, Steigerwald sort of followed up and he asked, did you see any suspicious activity outside of Kelsey's home? And Jackson said no. And so you do have a little bit of a win for the defense, where they said, well, Jackson was sort of looking out for a particular individual, and she didn't see that particular person. This person isn't named, but in any event, despite the vigilance of the cameras, Jackson never called police, right? So you have a little bit of a difference here between Trinastich, who sort of actively engaged the police, but then bear in mind that Nicole Atkinson actively engaged Trinastich. There was a ongoing conversation with everybody, and Chris Watts was there, whereas in this case Frazee didn't live in that particular condo. He wasn't supposed to be there, and he wasn't there with a whole huddle of people looking at how he was behaving and confronting him. So it's a little bit of a different situation. And then Steigerwald just to emphasize the point, I think implying that Jackson was maybe a bit lax in her approach. He asked if she'd seen someone with blood on them, would she have called the police? And Jackson answered, of course she would. And what this is a play on the mind of is basically that she didn't see someone covered in blood, and that even if she had, I guess this is sort of reverse psychology, even if she had, she didn't. In other words, there's a little bit of, arguably, there's a little bit of undermining the witness here. But, yeah, so one can sort of tell there was a bit of a ping-pong match going on between the witness and the defense attorney, because Jackson then sort of counted that her camera went off a lot more than it normally did on the afternoon of November 22nd. Specifically in the afternoon, not in the morning, a specific period in the afternoon. And this is while she was away from home. And she told the court that her phone kept buzzing on the table. She was at her mother's house at the time. You can understand it's Thanksgiving. She's not home. A lot of other people are with the people that they want to be with. You know, it's a holiday. People are relaxing, and you know, especially at lunchtime, people are preoccupied with Thanksgiving meals or whatever it is, and so it was theoretically a good time to execute a crime, particularly in that location. And although she was somewhere else, Jackson noticed that her phone kept buzzing on the table while she was at her mother's house, even though she was somewhere else. This phone just kept on alerting, and she said it did this more than 6 or 7 times. You know, that it went off for a usual day. I wouldn't put too much stake in that statement, because we get the digital analysis from Chad Minninger, who basically gives the exact number of notifications on a daily basis and then on that particular day. It looks like Chad Minninger, who's described as an investigator with the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office, he's the guy who actually went to the crime scene, and he sort of tested the cameras by walking in front of the door. I'm inferring this by the fact that he is associated with the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office. It could be somebody else, but it does seem likely that it would have been him. In any event, he went there to test the cameras, and then he noticed that it didn't always alert. One wonders when it didn't. You know, would it have been at night? Would it have been if he was wearing certain clothing, or if he was moving in a certain way? It would be good to get clarity on that. In any event, Minninger seems to be quite a specialist in his area. He'd been on the job for 14 years. So he's obviously got a lot of experience, and he told the court that he was able to use Celebrite technology to extract information from on Jackson's phone, based on the specific notifications from the security footage. From the news report I'm quoting from, which is I think from the Denver Channel, it refers to also just Minninger's CV, that it worked a total of 248 cases over the past 9 years, specifically using the Celebrite extraction technology. Interestingly, on Monday he gave a PowerPoint presentation showing how he compiled the data from Jackson's cell phone and how he went about the extraction process, and just how he sort of procedurally went through it and the sort of protocols he followed. Menninger also used Google Earth to sort of illustrate the layout of Kelsey's home, and he showed how on November the 21st Jackson's bedroom camera sent 4 notifications indicating some kind of activity was going on that particular day. So it seems that only 4 notifications occurred on November 21st. Meanwhile, on the 22nd, there were 27 alerts. There were 27 what is described here as instances of movement. That's quite a lot. That is, 6 times more than the average of the day prior, and then I guess afterwards as well. It would have been good to have gotten a lot more alerts from many more days prior. Maybe that'll come to light later on, and also subsequent. According to Menninger, the notifications came were sort of concentrated at around noon, between noon and 1:20 p.m., and then again later, so at 4:20 and 4:30. So it's interesting that there was a sort of a fair amount of a sort of a concentration of notifications clustered around 1:20, and then there's quite a long gap of 3 hours, and after the 3 hours then there's another cluster. And so what that raises the possibility of is that maybe the incident happened shortly after 1:20, and then there was an extensive activity inside the scene, possibly cleaning up, possibly disposal of evidence, possibly also possibly transporting Kelsey's remains. But bear in mind that they need to be transported in a way that aren't going to be seen. I should also point out here that a cadaver dog hit on the bumper area of Kelsey's car. I'm not completely clear on when exactly that was. In the report that I'm looking at from the Denver channel, it sort of talks about December 3rd, 4th and 6th, but I think those searches only, the cadaver dog searches only seem to happen a couple of days later, like closer to the 12th. There may also have been 2 separate searches. I know there was one search of of Kelsey's home. There was another separate search of Frazee's house. So it is possible that the first cadaver dog hit was fairly early on. When I say fairly early on, around about December 6th, which is still more than 2 weeks after her disappearance. It should also be noted that, and this is a serious problem for the prosecution, is that after a couple of days not hearing from her daughter, from his sister, Kelsey's mother and brother Clint headed to her home, and her mother had a key to get into the residence and gained access, and they called the police. The police sort of looked around and then left, and then the mother and son stayed in the crime scene effectively for a couple of days. They literally occupied the crime scene for a couple of days, and it was during one of these days that Clint noticed a tiny blood drop, I think at the base of the toilet. He was using the bathroom, and that was when he noticed this blood drop. And again, now this has strange echoes of the Amanda Knox case, where she would shower and so on while there were, was a bloody footprint on the mat. This is very different because it's like one tiny drop of blood, but it's still a situation where you can say, wasn't it clear enough to see early on? Why did it take this long? Something else that came up with the defense was they asked whether the family of Kelsey had used any cleaning products when they stayed in the home, and they said no, they'd only used soap to wash dishes. But you can already see how it is becoming a difficult case in terms of evidence, absolute evidence to prove one way or the other. Ultimately though, and I think this is very difficult to explain away, there were 11 alerts, 11 separate emails, 11 notifications with screen grabs that were sent to Jackson's phone that had pictures of Frazee on November 22nd. That's pretty damning. That's something that one cannot get away from, and one wonders whether he didn't make a similar mistake as Chris Watts. He may have been aware of certain cameras, but maybe underestimated them, and maybe also bargained on the fact that if enough time would go by, that footage would be lost. In any event, the footage of Frazee is a huge asset to the prosecution because it places him at the scene on a critical time. And I think what's also interesting is it doesn't place his mistress at the scene at that critical time. Now, without being able to see the footage, it's difficult to speculate. We do know that in the Trinastich case, the footage was of extremely poor quality. It was very difficult to see what was going on. You certainly didn't see bodies being carried out, and in the Frazee case, you probably don't either. But it was sufficient to be able to place the suspect at the scene at an exact time, and not only that, for a length of time. So it's not just as though he came and went. He came, stayed for quite a long time, and left after a suspicious period as well. With Chris Watts, you see the same thing. He doesn't just load his car and leave. He's sort of busy loading and doing things in a way that's not clear for quite a long time as well, 20 to 30 minutes. We even can see that Chris Watts changes his footwear. So that is pretty damning evidence, even if it's not crystal clear. So this brings us to some really, really fascinating intertextualities. I'm going to cover on them very lightly here. I cover them much in much greater detail in the book Murder Most Foul, and there are basically three intertextualities. One is the fact that Kelsey's daughter's name is Kaylee, spelled with a K, and obviously it's the same way that you would say the name of Casey Anthony's daughter. And you have kind of a reverse situation between the Casey Anthony case and the Chris Watts case and the Frazee case, in the sense that in one case you have only a child dying. In another case, the Frazee case, you have only the child kind of being rescued, right? And in the Chris Watts case, you have all the children in that particular case being done away with. So in one case you have the child being rescued, but the parent being killed. In the other one, just the child dies, and in the other, everybody dies, the children and the mother. So one does wonder whether the Casey Anthony case factored into the Chris Watts' thinking. It was the anniversary at the time. It was being covered in documentaries, and then whether it would have factored into Patrick Frazee's thinking as well, whether he paid any attention to the documentaries, whether the fact that there's all this talk of Kaylee Anthony and what happened to Kaylee, whether that triggered him in some way or got his thinking, one way or another. So that's one. I realize that's quite a vague one, but there are two others that are much stronger and really compelling. And it's the fact that Patrick Frazee contacted Patricia Kay on December 5th because he was concerned about the bank surveillance, the ATM surveillance data. He was concerned about that. He was concerned about timelines. And if you go to the Chris Watts archive, what was in the news on December 5th? And then we go to December 11th, and we see that he next approaches the Verizon store. This was, just a few days later, just 6 days later, he's in contact with David Fellis, and then you ask what was going on that day in terms of the coverage of the Chris Watts case, and was Frazee aware of it? Was Frazee sort of keeping tabs on the coverage of the Chris Watts case? And we know that he was living 130 miles due south of Frederick. The news was huge in Colorado and beyond, in America, even in the rest of the world. So the chance that Frazee wasn't paying attention to it is minimal. The chance that he was paying attention to it is very, very strong, and that he was adapting, possibly he was learning lessons, possibly he was trying to tailor what he was doing to the sort of cautionary tale of the mistakes Watts made. In other words, learning from Watts' mistakes. And this brings us to motive. I think in the same way with the Chris Watts case, where one intuits motive via some of the very complex relational dynamics between the husband and his wife, and in terms of the children and the pregnancy and the mistress and the money situation and sex and enmity with the in-laws. It's a complex motive, but one can sort of simplify it to be a stronger motive in one area than the other. In terms of the Frazee scenario, I think the motive is in some ways a lot simpler. I think it may have a lot more to do with issues of custody. We know that there were custody hearings shortly following Kelsey's disappearance. So you had Kelsey disappear, and then her mother wanted, I think, custody of Kaylee, and that led to custody hearings between Kelsey's mother and Patrick Frazee, and so I think that's very interesting. And then it's a little bit different to Watts. In Watts's case, I think the the alimony, if he didn't kill his wife and his children had survived, there would be alimony issues, and there would be also the financial burden there. I think the financial burden was also a factor in the Frazee case. We know that he stood to inherit some money, and that his own sister apparently approached Kelsey for dirt on Patrick. So Patrick Frazee's sister apparently contacted Kelsey for dirt on her brother, presumably as a way to get possibly more of the inheritance. I'm not quite sure what that's all about, but you certainly see trouble in the money area, and this whole inheritance thing was very much it was very relevant. It was happening I think around about October 30th, so barely 3 weeks before Kelsey's death. So Kelsey's disappearance, presumably her death. There are many additional aspects to highlight. It's difficult to highlight all of them in a short time. I mean, this video is already 45 minutes long, but I think one should just be aware that there are 3 counts of solicitation to commit murder, which is implying that there were at least 3 attempts to recruit somebody else in his scheme. So not just one, it's 3 counts. I think it's also important to highlight how when Frazee spoke to Patricia Key, he sort of misspoke, and he sort of at one point he said that Kelsey had spoken to her mother on, I think, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and then later on he said that he'd never said that. And this caught the sort of pricked Patricia Key's antenna. She was kind of alerted by this, and she was so concerned that this prompted her to call police. So I think that's quite significant. When she sort of confronted him about what he'd said, he denied that he'd said anything about the Sunday contact. Just a few other details worth pointing out. The thermostat, when when Cheryl and Clint arrived at the residence, noticed that it was very hot inside. Why was it so hot? The thermostat was set to 72 degrees, which is very warm, and it was Kelsey's habit to usually turn it down when she left the apartment, when she left the condo. And what does this signify? Well, it signifies possibly that someone had come in and cleaned, a lot of cleaning up, a lot of blood, and now you want the smell of the bleach and the smell of the cleaning to evaporate, and that's why it's turned up so high. Some people mentioned in the Chris Watts case that the fans were on when the police arrived. It's possible that they were put on purposefully to the same ends, but I think something like turning a thermostat up as high is definitely suspicious. The cleaning supplies is definitely a much stronger narrative in the Patrick Frazee case, and we can imagine why. If it was a violent death, if there was a lot of blood, there would be the need to clean up a lot, and there would be the need for an extensive and thorough cleaning operation. In a way, that's what makes the Chris Watts case quite exceptional and quite impressive. In a way, is that it's quite a clean crime. It's a silent crime, and it doesn't seem to have spilled a lot of or any blood and negligible body fluids of any kind. And very, very quickly, that crime scene was cleaned up to the extent that when people unexpectedly arrived, everything looked fine. What also corresponds between the two crimes is dirty clothes belonging to Kelsey were found. I think overalls were found sort of on the ground, and the laundry hadn't been done. Whereas in the Chris Watts case, there was sheets sort of lying on the ground, which Shanann would never have done. Okay, and a final thing that that should probably be highlighted is when Cheryl and Clint arrived and they sort of opened the door and they stepped inside. The first thing they sort of noticed was a pleasant smell, and we know that there's this allegation that something was put over Kelsey's head and she was asked to smell different candles, different scented candles, and that was when she was bludgeoned over the head. I think that's the prosecution's case. And so it makes sense that when Kelsey's family arrived at the residence, they smelled something, and apparently a candle was found sort of sitting on the stove. I'm not sure what to make of that. I'm not sure whether the stove has got something to do with causing the scent to be magnified. I don't know whether it's the kind of stove where you can literally put the candle on the stove and maybe it would melt a little bit or heat up a little bit, and that would put a fragrance into the air. But or if it's just coincidental that that a scented candle happened to be left on the stove. But just using logic, we know that a stove is a heating appliance, and one wonders whether Frazee would have, used that in two ways. One could have been to, if the scheme is true, to trick his fiancée into doing the smell test. But it may also be that the candles were used purposefully to mask the smell of bleach and cleaning chemicals. It's possible that there was no such scheme of having her smell anything. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but there may be another reason for these smells. And also, if you combine the clever idea of turning the heat up in the apartment with the scented candles, one wonders, were they already in the apartment or were they brought by somebody else? Where did that come from? So hopefully that'll be addressed throughout the unfolding trial narrative. Thanks very much for listening. It's very hard to touch on all the little aspects, but I am trying to highlight the sort of main things. If there's anything you feel that has been missed or that you want to address, then please leave a comment. Again, please subscribe to this channel, share amongst your networks, and I'll see you again tomorrow for trial day 3.
I don't really know what comes next. I'm just doing my best, even though I'm so stressed out. Everything just feels like a test that I fail, so depressed.